1. Freetown. Shakespeare drops the word into Romeo and Juliet. When the prince intervenes to quell the riot between the Montagues and Capulets in the first scene, he concludes his speech as follows: "You, Capulet, shall go along with me. A Montague, come you this afternoon, to know our farther pleasure in this case, to old Freetown, our common judgment place." Freetown. Shakespeare got it from Brooke, where Capulet's castle is called Freetown. Brooke Englished it from Pater, where Capulet's palace is Via Franca. But by transferring Freetown to the prince, transposing it beyond the story's scene, and making it our common judgment place, Shakespeare endued it with an authority which is suggestively otherworldly and egalitarian. By making it old Freetown, he lent it a further immemorial quality, as if it were somehow always there, somehow positively shadowing the imperfections of our civic life. There is a breath of equality in the prince saying, "You, Capulet, shall go along with me." And the use of the word pleasure in conjunction with Freetown anticipates something of the sex and mutuality of Romeo and Juliet, as opposed to the violence the prince interrupts. But Freetown is not a fantasy land of libertarian license. It is free town, placeholder for a real civil society. Free town, one that is defined above all by liberty and freedom. And it also is our common judgment place, whose freedom is sourced in and guaranteed by a totally inclusive conversation and agreement. In this small but significant moment of literary history, then, Shakespeare turned Freetown from the mere meaningless name of a posh villa into a real place and prospect, grounds for hope, albeit ones that remain just off stage. Verona may be fair, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, but Freetown is fairer, and this activates a significant pun where Freetown is fairer because it is fairer, more just. Freetown. It flashes on the mind's eye, and then it is gone, like the lightning, which doth cease to be, ere one can say, it lightens. But for me at least, it appears in another fleeting epiphany in Romeo and Juliet. Capulet has somehow tasked an illiterate servant with inviting a list of people over to his momentous masked ball, where of course Romeo and Juliet will meet. When this nonplussed man asks for help with reading the relevant names, Romeo sympathetically obliges. Takes the script and reads, Signor Martino and his wife and daughters, County Anselm and his beauteous sisters, the lady widow of Vitruvio, Signor Placentio and his lovely nieces, Mercutio and his brother Valentine, mine uncle Capulet, his wife and daughters, my fair niece Rosaline and Livia, Signor Valentio and his cousin Tybalt, Lucio and the lively Helena. Now I'm interested in the way that Mercutio and Tybalt appear in this list. Later in the play, Tybalt sneers, Mercutio, thou consortest with Romeo. To which Mercutio snorts, consort? What? Dost thou make us minstrels? The implication seems to be that Mercutio is gay, though if he is, he's unfulfilled, it being something of a downer to be a gay man in love with the most famous heterosexual in history. But then the list for Capulet's party actually intimates that Tybalt's gay as well. It's in verse, with each line economically, deftly, rather emblematically placing those to whom Capulet is extending his invitation. Some are presented in terms of the patriarchal family, Signor Martino and his wife and daughters, the lady widow of Vitruvio, a rather nice line of blank verse, mine uncle Capulet, his wife and daughters. Other lines pair men with attractive women, County Anselm and his beauteous sisters, Lucio and the lively Helena. And I feel compelled to say that Signor Placentio with his trophy nieces sounds particularly disagreeably pleased with himself. Anyway, it's in this overwhelming context of patriarchal families and lovely girls that Mercutio and Tybalt are accompanied by male Valentines. which in this, the greatest and most famous drama of sexual love in Western culture, is highly suggestive, to say the least. The continuing conversation between Romeo and Capulet's unlettered retainer infuses this prospect of sexual liberty with a transcendent, even heavenly aura. "A fair assembly," says Romeo, it's on the handout if you can see it. "Whither should they come?" So the serving man says, "Up." Romeo says, "Whither? To supper?" "To our house." "Whose house?" "My master's." Now, of course, the richest, most vivid icon of freedom in Romeo and Juliet is indisputably the superbly realised transgressive conjunction of Romeo and Juliet themselves. But this exchange between Romeo and Capulet's unlettered servant fleetingly extends the privileges of their love. A fair assembly. The pun on fair, just as well as beautiful, comes together with the political connotations of assembly and house to suggest that this heavenly fantasy could really be achieved by something resembling democratic struggle. After all, the pleasures proffered by the Capulet ball are very much this worldly ones: good company, good food, romance, the possibility of sex. That the benighted Capulet of Shakespeare's play is momentarily invested here with a more celestial authority sustains the possibility that sexual freedom might actually be realised in this world now. But then, of course, Brother Valentine and Signor Valentio don't actually consort with Mercutio and Tybalt at the Capulet ball. The play doesn't indicate that they make it to the party at all. And yet Capulet's bash, as much as any other scene in the play, dramatises the political possibility of Freetown. This is because it is masked. Given identities, privileges, prejudices, and names are suspended, and the dialogue hints that the disguises worn are actually truer to the undetermined potential of human freedom than the socially recognisable, limited, and corrupted faces they cover. It is this which enables Romeo and Juliet to meet, converse, dance, fall in love. The ball truly is a fair assembly, and to that extent can be thought of as really taking place in Freetown, not Verona. But the fair assembly could be fairer still. Romeo and Juliet condemns Mercutio to wild, hilarious, and melancholy opposition to a world which cannot accommodate him. In Tybalt, Mercutio's surreal irony becomes sheer fury. The male Valentines, which Shakespeare so briefly conjures for them, express the tantalising possibility that Mercutio's and Tybalt's amazing energy could be redeemed into a love which expresses the same degree of force in a more positive form. Romeo and Juliet lose their bliss in the process of attaining it. That is their tragedy. But at least Romeo and Juliet attain their tragedy. We pity them, but they make it that far. Mercutio and Tybalt stand for the many more who don't. So, it's time Mercutio and Tybalt got a dance. Brother Valentine, Signor Valentio, boys, you too shall go to the ball. Here's something we can do for Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet. We can imagine Mercutio and Brother Valentine, Signor Valentio and Tybalt, masked or unmasked, wearing what you like, or better still, what they like, and dancing with 400 years of emancipated joy. Of course, Romeo and Juliet are there too, their words, bodies and beings, describing one shared smile, which this time isn't the least bit star-crossed, misadventured, or otherwise doomed. That's what a party in Freetown looks like. Let's drink to it at the reception. Okay, so far, so I hope, uplifting. Freetown, the place with no bar to Romeo and Juliet's love. No bar to Mercutio and Valentine's. Bring it on. But we're not finished yet. Shakespeare's fearless exploration of free love suggests there is more to Freetown. The balcony scenes, for instance, take us to the next level. Here are some of Juliet's best lines. My bounty is as boundless as the sea, my love as deep. The more I give to thee, the more I have, for both are infinite. Oceanic feeling phasing softly into endlessness. I've suggested the unfulfilled Mercutio relates to the unredeemed world of Verona, which can't positively accommodate him by means of energetic irony. But of course, such irony ultimately feeds off and so negatively preserves the status quo. Juliet's speech is actually more negative, going beyond all bounded forms of life as we know it. into boundlessness. Indeed, it's worth remarking that one of the most cherishable things about Shakespeare's play is the way in which the utterly particular, a teenage girl's amorous enthusiasm becomes universal. But where does this leave us here below? Indeed, where does it leave Juliet? It leaves her hungering for two things with a chance of accessing the infinite: sex and marriage. Indeed, inasmuch as both aim at absolute union, these two are one. But sex and marriage are forms of this life. They communicate with the infinite only inasmuch as they become hospitable and even transparent to death. And this is where the implied vision of Freetown and civic flourishing in Romeo and Juliet is radically, even frighteningly changed. For it's clear that no simply positive adjustment, such as gay liberation, will enable final fulfillment in Freetown. Identity politics isn't enough. Certainly the play asks us to imagine how Mercutio's negativity might be more positively fulfilled by the negation of negative conditions that gay liberation would entail. It insists Freetown has to be able to accommodate Mercutio and Valentine, as well as Romeo and Juliet, even if it does so briefly. For Mercutio and Valentine are entitled to their basic liberties, to sex and why not marriage, just as Romeo and Juliet require theirs. Nevertheless, it won't do to imagine a smug and sated Mercutio. It wouldn't even be Mercutio. Nor will it satisfy to imagine Romeo and Juliet in a better world where they get married, have kids, and get fat. There is no Mercutio without his restless energy. No Romeo and Juliet without their more positive negation of ordinary life, for which another name is the infinite or eternal. But wait, what form of social organisation could possibly accommodate this? Juliet's ecstatic speeches turn explicitly away from light, just as Romeo was said to have done in the first scene, favouring instead night, death and darkness. This is strange love grown bold indeed, and its implications are more than personal in a play which doesn't indulgently withdraw from the world, but instead fearlessly explores the nature and destiny of free love in relation to civic questions. Remember, Juliet says, "Come, civil night." And with that, the precious and enigmatic idea of Freetown becomes a considerably darker thing. Two, free man. In September 1769, the great Shakespearean actor David Garrick made Freetown a bit more real. And he did so in the then obscure provincial English town that happens to be Shakespeare's birthplace, and of course now houses the Shakespeare Institute, not to mention the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and the Royal Shakespeare Company. Garrick's Stratford Jubilee wasn't just the first major Shakespeare celebration, it seeded all others. More than anything, bar Shakespeare's birth itself, it put Stratford on the map. Indeed, for the first time, it provided decent access to the town by road. Whenever there's cause to celebrate Shakespeare, the Jubilee comes to mind. And it's no accident that the 3 authoritative book-length studies were published in the previous anniversary year of 1964. Now that 2014 and the 450th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth are upon us, and what with 2016's 500th anniversary of Shakespeare's death fast approaching, the Jubilee's interest freshens again. But it's worth stressing that in 1769, it was all freshness. Cosy, ironic, or weary familiarity with what literary festivities can become, or have become, can prevent us from grasping how novel and surprising it was, perhaps even to Garrick himself. I suggest that the Jubilee moved through Garrick. It was a happening, mocked and marvelled at, ideologically disorganised, susceptible to different interpretations, and yet, if only we have eyes to see it, instrumental to the association of Shakespeare with freedom that proved important to Western modernity and might still provide us with a credible, substantial and interesting reason for celebrating Shakespeare today. Stratford Town Council precipitated the Jubilee by making Garrick its first ever free man, successfully flattering him into donating a statue for the gaping niche in the sheep street-facing facade of the recently rebuilt town hall. But practical considerations apart, transforming Garrick into the free man was a decisive step towards the creative conjunction of Shakespeare and freedom. The actor had already done much to link his name and fortunes with Shakespeare's, both on stage at Drury Lane and by erecting a Shakespeare temple, no less, in his garden at Hampton, whose fine statue by Roubiliac, now in the British Museum, and there's one of Alexander Pope upstairs in this great collection of art. That fine statue of Shakespeare, however, by Roubiliac, was said to look as much like Garrick as it did the Bard. And yet Garrick's encroachment on the great man's identity and reputation was justified, inasmuch as he really did possess an actor's gift that was supremely well matched to Shakespeare's talent for characterization. With his darting glance and mobile face, he alone could live up to what Keats described as the man Keats described as the chameleon poet, and that'll teach me for straying from my script. Now Richard III, now Romeo, now Macbeth, Garrick could seemingly become anyone, free man indeed. Stratford formally honoured this freedom in an exquisite box carved from the mulberry tree it maintained was, quote, undoubtedly planted by Shakespeare's own hand. This artefact too is now kept in the British Museum. It's a finely carved piece, detailed with beguiling Shakespeareana and a frieze on its back of Garrick as Lear on the heath. There it is. In return for this rich gift of freedom, Garrick furnished the town hall with its Shakespeare statue, which, have a look next time you're there, still stands proud if somewhat blackened by age over Sheep Street, along with a portrait of Shakespeare to hang inside. Most importantly, Stratford's first freeman gave the town its Jubilee in honour of its most famous son. And with that, the idea of Freetown, I suggest, really shimmers into life again. Of course, Garrick saw the Jubilee as a wonderful opportunity to enhance his own interest, celebrity and identification with Shakespeare. And you've got to say, why not? But it seems equally clear he was moved to extend and share the Shakespearean freedom which the corporation had conferred on him, and which he no doubt felt already blessed by the dramatist in the form of his vocation for the Shakespearean stage. With the Jubilee, Garrick took Shakespeare to the people. He took him out of the institutions of the theatre and scholarship and quite literally to the streets. This contemporary watercolour from the collection of our friends at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust shows Garrick presiding over the Jubilee in gorgeous style, sporting his long staff with his large mulberry wood Shakespeare medallion hanging round his neck, trimmed in multicoloured ribbon, the free man as the rainbow man. But Garrick wasn't just arrogating the bard's many splendid freedom to himself. On the contrary, he really did give Shakespeare's freedom away. To the schedule of the day's entertainments, he added this: the steward hopes that the admirers of Shakespeare will upon this occasion wear the favours, which are called the Shakespeare favours. Note that the free man is happy to turn steward in order to celebrate Shakespeare's freedom. The sashes, rosettes and badges he commends to the crowd were made of a rich silk ribbon, 3 inches wide with a picot edge. The ribbon maker, one Mr. Jackson of Coventry, explained in the flyers that were handed about, a ribbon has been made on purpose at Coventry, called the Shakespeare ribbon. It is an imitation of the rainbow, which uniting the colours of all parties is likewise an emblem of the great variety of his genius. Each change of many-coloured life he drew. And there it is, that's also from the archives of the Birthplace Trust. Thus did every lapel in Stratford gorgeously proclaim that Shakespeare's inclusive genius really was meant to be for each and all. It was a constant theme of the Jubilee. Communal feasting and singing were central. At the most ceremonious banquet, the free man served up turtle. A hell of a turtle, in fact. It weighed, when living, no less than 327 pounds. Why turtle? Let the type and shadow of the master grace his board, Garrick's great correspondent Edmund Burke had written, explaining that it was the consummation of all meats, and therefore most fitting for a dinner in honour of one who, quote, can represent all the solidity of flesh, the volatility of fowl, and the oddity of fish. The lad of all lads was a Warwickshire lad, sang Stratford, and thus was Shakespeare's freedom at once celebrated and brought home. And if the keynote was of bright festivity, that wasn't exclusive of more serious, even quasi-religious feelings, as became clear when, after Garrick had edified everyone with his Shakespeare ode, they all passed round and eagerly drank from a mulberry goblet that was ornamented with silver. Garrick was a worshipper himself, as Cooper wrote in The Task. He drew the liturgy and formed the rites and solemn ceremonial of the day, and called the world to worship on the banks of Avon, famed in song. He called the world to worship. It is scarce credible the number of persons of all ranks that came to see it, marvelled the public advertiser. The costs may have been prohibitive, and Garrick may have ridiculed the Stratford locals when he reprised the Jubilee for his Drury Lane audiences, but the original intention and atmosphere of his first ever Shakespeare Jubilee was unprecedentedly liberal and inviting. And if it at least symbolically involved everyone, it also extended a new spirit of tolerant inclusiveness to all aspects of human personality. Wenches! Never was any paradise so plentifully and beautifully inhabited as here at this time, according to the excited correspondent of Lloyd's Evening Post. And if you didn't like wenches, there was a horse race. Garrick didn't dodge the darker aspects of freedom we have seen already in Romeo and Juliet. His bard is the more godlike for his daimonic inscrutability. Consider lines such as this, for instance: "The subject passions round him wait, who though unchained and raging there he checks, inflames, or turns their mad career." This presents Shakespeare as a sorcerer, possessed of a hectic and rather frightening power in tension with the civilizing mission that the ode otherwise invests him with. And when Garrick tries to phase away from such daimonic passions into an overwhelming joy, that joy quickly darkens into wildly permissive sensuality, which seems to remember and reprise them. With kindling cheeks and sparkling eyes, the bard in transport dies. This makes us very intimate with Shakespeare indeed. The ode goes on to envision in intricate detail his ecstatic mental impregnation, the huge fruit of which is testimony, of course, to his amazing fertility, but also suggests an exceptionally painful birth. For what springs fully formed from Shakespeare's head isn't a paragon of conventional virtue, nor even some sylph-like goddess, nor even Hamlet, but rather the enormous libertine Falstaff, his superabundant largeness very explicitly expressing a vitality that exceeds all limits, or as Garrick puts it, a world where all pleasures abound. For we're told the world too is wicked and round. So Falstaff will never decline, and his rain and his rivers are wine, and away with all sorrow and care. Thus the Rainbow Man presents the Fat Man as the happy avatar of all the freedom and fullness of Shakespearean being, and he does so without blanding out the darker shades of the spectrum which such freedom entails. That he does in public and in relation to rebuilding a town hall, and by implication a real community, is striking, and perhaps should put us on our mettle as we celebrate Shakespeare in 14 and 16. At its heart, Garrick's civic Shakespeare ode offers an undiscriminating celebration of life. Banish plump Jack and banish all the world. But Falstaff returns from banishment to Stratford in 1769 to become the unexpected type of civic flourishing, a flourishing based not as it usually is on sacrifice and repression, but on emancipating all we desire and are. The first ever Shakespeare Jubilee has been especially mocked for not in fact including any Shakespeare. And it's difficult to imagine that a Shakespeare festival today could get away without including any of the plays or poems. But I've been trying to bring out a neglected radical stripe to what Garrick did. He celebrated Shakespeare not so much as literary heritage to be preserved against the depredations of time and change, but instead as example and inspiration. He celebrated Shakespeare in Stratford 1769 as the very quintessence of freedom, as the proof and promise of new life. Wilkes and liberty. The political muse of the Jubilee was the maverick demagogue John Wilkes. Champion of electoral reform, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and even a free America, more of which later, Wilkes was the foremost figurehead for liberty in British politics. But he was just as much a libertine, author of the pornographic poem, an essay on woman, and leading light of the Hellfire Club, who dressed in Franciscan robes to enact mad, drunken debauchery with courtesans attired as nuns, and on one infamous occasion, a baboon. The inspiring attractions of political liberalism and the darker freedoms it might entail come together in Wilkes. When he was imprisoned for seditious libel for his attack on George III in number 45 of his radical paper, The North Briton, the cry of Wilkes and liberty rang through British politics. The protest was serious and sustained, with 7 protesters dying as they chanted, "No liberty, no king," at the St George's Field massacre in 1768, the year before the Jubilee. Jubilees in honour of Wilkes and liberty likewise preceded Garrick's first Shakespeare Jubilee and had provided a model for it. Coverage of events in Stratford in Lloyd's Evening Post on the 8th of September 1769 made the connection, but Garrick also alluded to it himself in a cryptic announcement he placed in the Public Advertiser on the 8th of July 1769. And again, if you can see it, this is on the handout as well. A card. The mulberry box presents compliments to the Standish of the same materials, hoping that they shall very soon meet at the London Tavern, and that an uninterrupted friendship may thenceforward succeed to their late separation, as they are appointed to joint shares in the same office, viz. Grooms of the stool to the supporters of the Bill of Rights. Well, I say cryptic, but you'll recognise the mulberry box as the exquisite artefact we've met already, within which Garrick received his freedom of Stratford. The Standish of the same materials was a gift given by Stratford to George Keate for delivering his freedom to Garrick. The Society of the Supporters of the Bill of Rights was founded in 1769, the year of the Jubilee, to aid Wilkes and press for parliamentary reform. It was the first major extra-parliamentary political association in Britain. Garrick, therefore, in the Evening Post, is making a connection between the freedom of Stratford and the serious campaign for political freedom that's getting underway in the period. Indeed, he subordinates Shakespeare and Stratford to that real-world campaign by casting himself and Keate as grooms of the stool to the supporters of the Bill of Rights. Now, of course, the political vitality of the association of Shakespeare and freedom outlasts Wilkes, and we'll see that. And though it's true that Wilkes influenced Garrick's Shakespeare Jubilee, the Jubilee in turn influenced the cause of Wilkes and liberty. After Stratford, Jubilees very much based on what Garrick had done for Shakespeare were held in Wilkes's honour. Wilkes's 45th birthday on October the 28th, 1769, a special one because it resonated with and recalled the crucial rebellious number 45 of the North Briton, was duly celebrated. It was actually celebrated in King's Bench Prison, with songs adapted from the Jubilee songbook, Shakespeare's Garland, and another £300 turtle. It was done all over again on the 18th of April 1770, the day of Wilkes's enlargement. The published text on this occasion is dedicated to, quote, the spirited and noble freeholders of Middlesex, who had repeatedly voted for Wilkes each time his election was declared void by the government on questionable grounds. These celebrations recognise that, quote, Mr. Garrick may brag of his Warwickshire wag, but they reappropriate the greatest hit of the Jubilee as follows. No threats, no persuasions can move him, still true to a people who love him. Their laws and their rights he will ever defend, for the friend of all friends is a Middlesex friend. Middlesex friend, freedom defend, and the friend of all friends is a Middlesex friend. They also include a 9th song, To Liberty, to be sung to, quote, to any tune that the reader pleases. And the freedom train rolls on, carrying the hope of Freetown into a post-Jubilee future. If we now look just briefly back at the Shakespeare Tercentenary of 1864, for instance, we find this boldly printed handbill. Time, Shakespeare, the poet of the people. People of Stratford, where are the seats reserved for you at the forthcoming festival? What part or lot have you, who originated it, in the coming celebration? None! But you will be permitted to see the fireworks because they can't be let off in the pavilion. And you're promised something for yourself after the swells have dined. Only wait till the next week and see the dainty mess that shall be brewed for you out of their cold whittles. People of Stratford, who would not see your town disgraced on such an occasion, your streets empty or blocked up by the carriages of profitless swells. Take counsel together at once, call a meeting without delay, form your own committee, hold your own festival, look to your own business, lay out your own money, get up your own outdoor sports and indoor pastimes, and let your watchword be Shakespeare, the poet of the people, and hurrah for the pageant. The people got their pageant and some 30,000 came to enjoy it. I think it's amazing to reflect on this as we think of celebrating Shakespeare anniversaries in the next couple of years. If we could get 30,000. Meanwhile, in London, the Working Men's Shakespeare Committee planted a tree in Shakespeare's memory on Primrose Hill, and then went on to conduct a political protest in favour of General Garibaldi, a demonstration that had to be broken up by the police. The concreteness and sheer popularity of the historical association of Shakespeare and liberty in this country is evinced by the production in 1864 of matching ceramic figures of Garibaldi and Shakespeare. And I'm grateful to Martin Colleen, the superb librarian at the Cadbury Research Library, for that image. They really look like twins, and theirs, presumably, is the face of freedom. If you look harder at it, perhaps you can see the ancestral resemblance to Garrick. Wilkes was uglier, but if you look hard enough, maybe you can see him too. Viva la libertà. 4. Michael Dobson has pointed to a major apparent contradiction of the Jubilee, its celebration of Shakespeare both as a universal genius and as specifically English. The lad of all lads is a Warwickshire lad. But the centrality of the idea of freedom to the festival can perhaps help resolve some of this tension. Shakespeare's freedom frees the English to be themselves, throwing off the yoke of more established cultures, Greece, Rome and France. Free Shakespearean England then in turn sets other cultures free. This romance of freedom explains why news of the first Shakespeare Jubilee was enthusiastically received even in France, despite Garrick's mocking subversion of French pretensions to cultural superiority. During the festivities, Garrick saw off a planted actor, Tom King, pretending to be a Shakespeare detractor. But it was from the Mercure de France, December 1769, that Goethe copied an extensive account of Garrick's Fête de Shakespeare into his volume of Wieland's German translation of the Bard's works. Germany is the most striking example in Western culture of how Shakespearean freedom fueled nascent nationalism. Shakespeare comes to represent their own potential freedom to the Germans. But the international potential of Shakespeare's freedom was in fact already evident during the Jubilee itself. It was not confined to the English only, reported the Public Advertiser, for the Scotch and the Irish were as eager in paying their devotion. We've seen that Garrick's subsequent account of the festival to Drury Lane mockingly excluded Stratford residents. It also excluded the Irish. Perhaps Garrick was finally overwhelmed by the relentless attacks of those theatre folk such as Samuel Foote and scholars such as George Stevens, who were horrified, I suggest, by the threat his great Shakespeare giveaway represented to their own Shakespearean interests. But Garrick was probably also influenced by resuming his institutional role back in the capital of discrimination in London as its leading actor-manager. In any case, he partially retreated from the radical inclusivity of what he'd attempted in Stratford. Still, the part played there by the Scot, James Boswell, sufficiently demonstrates that the first Shakespeare Jubilee really wasn't just English for the English. Boswell came to Stratford resplendent in the costume of a Corsican chief. It's a shame it's not in full colour. As the latter-day editors of his journals suggest, he saw in Corsica's fight for independence, first from the Genoese, then from the French, his own private struggles for liberty externalised. Boswell visited Corsica, went native with the rebels there, and launched himself when he returned into an elaborate newspaper campaign intended ultimately to persuade the British government to intervene and support them. He personally raised money to arm the rebels, and he edited a volume of essays in favour of the brave Corsicans. But his little monument to liberty, quote unquote, was his own book, An Account of Corsica, the journal of a tour to that island, and memoirs of Pascal Paoli, the Corsican rebel leader. It was a great success in Britain and in Europe, and it had a real impact on European politics. The French government commissioned a translation, and the British sent secret supplies to the Corsicans. But in spite of Boswell's efforts, they weren't about to declare war on France on behalf of a small island of apparently little strategic interest, and the rebels had been decisively routed by the time of the Stratford Jubilee. But that didn't stop Boswell from hitching his one-man international liberation movement to Garrick's Shakespeare's festival. His diary entry for the 2nd of September 1769 tells how, in preparation for Stratford, he sought out, quote, an embroiderer in Bow Street, Covent Garden, gave him cut out in paper as well as I could, the form of a Corsican cap, and ordered, Viva la libertà, to be embroidered on the front of it in letters of gold. 2 days later, he was tramping all over London, searching for other Corsican necessaries, then happily observing that he could get it all in his, quote, travelling bag, except for my musket and staff. The staff he describes as a very handsome vine with the root uppermost, and upon it a bird very well carved. I paid 6 shillings for it, he records. I told the master of the shop, why, sir, this vine is worth any money. It is a Jubilee staff. That bird is the bird of Avon. Sorry, Dad. Only a deep and natural association of Shakespeare and freedom will make of Boswell's Corsican kit and a staff that might have been carved in Arden such a miraculously coherent ensemble. It suggests that the time was ripe for Garrick to turn Stratford into Freetown. In the course of his trip there, Boswell attempts to keep his Shakespearean come Corsican thirst for liberty pure by marshalling the image of his fiancée, or as he prefers to call her, my valuable spouse, against any spectres of sexual temptation. He takes the road in high excitement, travelling part of the way in the company of an agreeable and familiar female escort. I elude myself no other liberty than once drawing my hand gently along her yellow locks, he insists. When he finds himself at the Jubilee chatting up Captain Sheldon's wife, and with the image of his valuable spouse fading alarmingly, he improvises. I rose and went near the orchestra and looked steadfastly at that beautiful, insinuating creature, Mrs. Badley of Drury Lane. And in an instant, Mrs. Sheldon was effaced. Here, that same tension between liberty and libertinism that we saw in Wilkes is brought into a much more explicit association with Shakespearean freedom. But Boswell also lived it up in the sense of being seriously edified by the Jubilee. He felt for a moment that he could live a better life if he lived it in Stratford, but we all quickly grow out of that delusion. His Corsican contribution was a hit, and he wrote his, quote, verses in the character of a Corsican at Shakespeare's Jubilee, in the midst of the festivities. They tell the story of a proud, noble exile come, quote, I'm not going to do Corsican Scots, to soothe my soul on Avon's sacred stream, offering a piteous glimpse of the Corsican river Golo, which dejected, injured freedom bends. They suggest that if Shakespeare had lived, quote, our story to relate, and Garrick had deigned to act it, then, quote, from his eyes had flashed the Corsic fire, men had less gazed to pity than admire. O happy Britons, the peroration swells, on whose favoured isle propitious freedom ever deigns to smile. Let me plead for liberty distressed, with generous ardour make us also free, and give to Corsica a noble jubilee. A word on Boswell's timing. In one sense, it was sheer vanity to have continued the campaign for Corsican liberty when that had clearly become impossible. But Walter Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history suggest that in order to save the future, we first have to save the past, redeeming its lost potential in the interests of a better tomorrow. And perhaps it was in that spirit that Boswell took it upon himself to embody and plead for Corsican liberty, just as it was sliding into the dustbin of history. Though he excluded the Irish, Garrick included the Corsican Boswell in his stage play about the Jubilee, and Boswell seems to have lent Garrick his costume so that the impersonation might be more apt. That figure of the Corsican Boswell embodies the hope of the Jubilee at its best, that Shakespeare's freedom might come to be the glory of a free people who felicitate in the freedom of others. That was the last part, 5, land of the free. But if the Jubilee was associated with nationalism, it's also been associated with the inception of empire. In support of this, Michael, for instance, fished out the following anonymous but contemporary verses from the bowels of the Bodleian. While Britain's bow at Shakespeare's shrine, Britannia's sons are sons of mine. Like him should Britain scorn the art that binds in chains the human heart. Like him should still be unconfined and rule the world as he the mind. It's notable that the Shakespearean conception of empire expressed here is explicitly imagined as freedom at its fullest extent, and freedom is also crucial to that more familiar and less Nietzschean rationalisation according to which empire actually liberates its British subjects. Having said that, if Shakespearean freedom inaugurates empire, it also inspires Americans, for instance, to resist English domination before and after the Revolution. The nascent German nation appropriated Shakespearean freedom as its own destiny. The Americans were quicker to mobilise Shakespearean freedom against the English. Instructive here are the rival New York performances of Macbeth by the American actor Edwin Forrest, known as the native tragedian, and the great English Shakespearean of his day, Charles Macready. A head-to-head which precipitated the Astor Place riots, one of the most lamentable episodes in the city's history before 9/11. Forrest, who at his smouldering best looked like an antebellum Elvis, was the very incarnation of American independence. There he is, as Elvis and as Macbeth. Early in life, he said, I took a great deal of exercise and made myself what I am, a Hercules. He probably said it better than that. And perhaps that's too traditional and derived from civilized models, since according to one reviewer, his voice was, quote, replete with a rough music, befitting one who in his youth had dwelt a free barbarian among the mountains. His acting lent Shakespeare's great male parts, and it really did, I think, an explosive physical immediacy and power. Other favourite roles, and I'm indebted to Michael for this too, included the peasant revolutionary Jack Cade, whose last triumphant utterance is, the bondman is avenged, my country free, and the native American Metamora, whose piercing battle cry goes, our lands, our nation's freedom, or the grave. In 19th century New York, Forrest was the hero of the gangs and theatre of the Bowery, the theatre being, as Walt Whitman recalled, no dainty kid glove business, but electric force and muscle from perhaps 2,000 full-sinewed men. Now this presented, to say the least, a very different kind of theatre from that in which Macready excelled. There's Macready. In fact, on the transatlantic Shakespeare circuit, Forrest at first made a friend of the Englishman, but he was increasingly offended by Macready's more academic and reflective style, which to the native tragedian smelt of the persistent pretensions of English imperialism. Their rivalry played out on both sides of the pond, and when Macready's Edinburgh Hamlet sported distractedly with a handkerchief as he cogitated and agonised, in a gesture Forrest would subsequently denominate a pas de mouchoir, the American was there to hiss him, rather than to kiss him, to hiss him. And it wasn't long before he was referring to his rival as the superannuated driveller. It's actually unfair that by the time of the crisis, Macready in New York had come to stand for the elite exclusivity of English culture, since unlike his friend Charles Dickens, he was a great admirer of American liberty, and at one time had wanted to retire to Massachusetts. But Forrest and his supporters were bent on punishing Macready and the English in the name of Shakespearean freedom, and nothing could stop them now. When Macready's Macbeth was being heckled and pelted in the upscale Astor Place Theatre on the evening of the 7th of May, 1854, Forrest roared from one of the city's other stages, "What rhubarb, senna, or what purgative drug would scour these English hence?" As Nigel Cliff tells the story, 4,000 people rose as one, and for several minutes they cheered for America. Now, Macready kept his dignity throughout the crisis, which is no mean feat, but he was ready to go home, and who can blame him? That he didn't was only because what turned out to be a misguided delegation led by Washington Irving, no less, and horrified by the fast-developing stain on New York's international reputation as a centre for civilized culture, persuaded him to perform again. In the meantime, posters were rushed up all over New York that exactly anticipate the idiom of revolt we've already encountered on the handbills distributed for the tercentenary celebrations in Stratford. Shakespeare, the poet of the people, people of Stratford, etc. But in New York, the immediate consequences would be graver. Working men, shall Americans or English rule in this city? The crew of the British steamer have threatened all Americans who shall dare to express their opinions this night at the English aristocratic opera house. We advocate no violence, but a free expression of opinion to all public men, working men, free men. Stand by your lawful rights. Signed by the American Committee. Now, the crew of the British steamer hadn't actually threatened anything of the sort, but when Macready resumed the stage at Astor Place on the 10th of May, a 15,000-strong mob descended and attacked the theatre. It all ended, as you see, you can just see the rifles there, with soldiers firing at point-blank range on a civilian crowd, at least 26 of whom died. In a sense, these dead are the casualties of the idea of Shakespearean freedom. Macready had to be smuggled out of the city in disguise. It is surely one of the darkest days in the history of Shakespeare reception. But Shakespearean freedom had another major effect on American politics, and in such a way as still further darkens the motif. We have seen that Wilkes was via Garrick associated with Shakespeare as a proponent of freedom, and he had a major impact on American revolutionary thought. But in American history, Wilkes and Shakespeare are strikingly reunited in the career of John Wilkes Booth, who of course assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. Booth was the son of the English Shakespearean actor Junius Brutus Booth, who was Edmund Kean's greatest rival. Junius Brutus was named after the most obvious exemplar of Shakespearean freedom, and the one who, at least in part, inspired his son to kill the president. Kean, for his part, could be cast as an exemplar of Shakespearean freedom at its most unrestrained. And Junius Brutus, the assassin's alcoholic, bigamist, and not infrequently deranged dad, aka the mad tragedian, certainly gives him a run for his money, but that's another story. Booth himself was named after that other avatar of liberty we've met already, John Wilkes, a distant relative. His family home, which is still standing, is called Tudor Hall. He went to the Miltons boarding school for boys. He became an actor, and if he acted in Julius Caesar or exerted scenes just 6 times, he nevertheless knew the play by heart from childhood. It'd be nice to think he wasn't, but he was a notable talent. Whitman again suggesting that he had flashes of, quote, real genius. In 1863 in Washington, he was billed as, quote, the pride of the American people. Booth's sister recalled that as the Confederacy's defeat became more and more certain, her brother started to fulminate in wild tirades against Lincoln making himself a king. When Robert E. Lee surrendered, Booth said he was done with the stage, and the only part he wanted to play now, the only play he wanted to play in now was Venice Preserved, which is about assassination. Booth killed the president in his box at Ford's Theatre in Washington, and jumping on the stage on which he'd frequently acted himself, waved a knife and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, which is attributed to Brutus at Caesar's assassination and is also the Virginia state motto. According to Thomas Goodrich, all the elements in Booth's nature came together at once: his hatred of tyranny, his love of liberty, his passion for the stage. And it's impossible to deny that mixed up in this was Shakespeare, Brutus, John Wilkes, Milton, and the heady modern idea of freedom to which they all contribute. Frederick Douglass called the assassination an unspeakable calamity for African Americans. And of course, a major irony of Confederate fighting talk about American freedom is that it's premised on denying the emancipation of their slaves. The diary of the hunted assassin suggests unstable alternations between self-assertion and self-doubt that are reminiscent of James Hogg's The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. With every man's hand against me, Booth writes, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honoured for. And yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat. The best of the cutthroats. As his final entries betray, and as Stephen Dickey recognises, Booth ultimately havers in Shakespearean terms between, quote, the valiant tyrannicide Brutus and, quote, the murderous tyrant Macbeth, who resolves for no surrender but to fight the course. It would no doubt be most comfortable just to leave it at that. But John Wilkes Booth, son of a Shakespearean actor, himself a Shakespearean actor, namesake of that radical politician most associated with the first ever great Shakespeare Jubilee, unavoidably expresses something of the disturbing instability of Shakespearean freedom, liberalism and its discontents, and yet presumably we don't wish to give it up either. It could cut Mercutio free. It's the ecstasy that's really tasted by Romeo and Juliet. It's what Stratford's first free man proclaimed when he called the world to worship at Freetown on the banks of the Avon. Thank you.